Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rashid DeRosso. I am the Civics Program Director here at Democracy Prep Public Schools. We're very excited for our virtual panel today, More Than a Moment, a Juneteenth Community Conversation on the State of Black Life in the United States. A couple of notes before we dive in. Number one, we have a number of speakers who represent a broad spectrum of specializations within the larger movement to build a more equitable society. For that reason, our format is going to be more of a presentation style where we'll be speaking to each individual's panelist first. And at the end, when there's available time remaining, we're going to then open up to questions. Nevertheless, feel free to type your questions into the question and answer section. We will have part of the Democracy Prep team looking through those questions throughout the entirety of the session. Another note that this is going to be recorded, so those of you interested in sharing with friends or following up about certain parts, know that we will make it available for all parties interested. With that, we are going to turn this over to our CEO, Ms. Natasha Trivers.
Thank you so much, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to More Than a Moment, a Juneteenth Community Conversation on the state of Black life in the United States. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you especially to our panelists. Rashid will introduce them in a moment as we begin the conversation, but we are so grateful for you blessing us with your presence today and sharing your wisdom and your thoughts. Today is a really important day in the history of our country and the history specifically of Black people in America. Today marks the 155th year since word reached the last enslaved Africans in America. Yet, as the last few months have shown, we're still very much dealing with the vestiges of American slavery. Black people in this country have come a long way. We've esteemed professors like the ones with us today, doctors, lawyers, chemists, and entrepreneurs. But we are here leading these types of forums because we still have so much work to do. And at Democracy Prep, we want to be a part of the solution, and we will not shy away from being part of the Black Lives Matter conversation and the state of Black life in this country conversation. We're at a defining moment in American history, and we intend to be on the right side of history on the movement for Black lives. As a charter organization, we haven't always gotten it right, but we are working every day to become more of an anti-racist organization. That is what we can commit to, and I'm proud to lead the charge and lead by example with forums such as this one. With that, I turn it over to our Director of Civics, Rashid DeRosso, who will introduce our speakers for today.
Thank you. Before we do that, we would like to take a moment of silence to reflect on the names of the people whose lives have been lost prematurely over the past several years. Thank you. And with that, I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then each of our panelists will receive a more lengthier introduction as we dive into the topics. The first is Dr. Sheldon Applewhite. He is the Assistant Professor of Sociology in the Social Services and Human Services Department of the Borough of Manhattan Community College. Then we have Dr. Sasha Bamir, internist and nephrologist from New York and New Jersey. We have Dr. Mena Demesi, Vice President of Policy Analysis and Research for the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, Incorporated. We have Ms. Shaniqua McClendon, Political Director for Crooked Media. And then we have Ms. Paula White, Executive Director for Educators for Excellence. Thank you all for being with us. To give our attendees a clearer sense of what today's session is going to look like. We've divided up our discussion along lines of the various aspects of Black life that we'd like to consider today. The first is going to be Black civic life and civic engagement. We're going to start by speaking with Dr. Mena Demesi. She's the Vice President, as I noted before, of Policy Analysis and Research at the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation, Incorporated, where she leads the foundation's research and policy initiatives that affect African Americans and the global Black community in areas including education, criminal justice, economic opportunity, voting, and environmental sustainability, among many others. Dr. Demesi is the founder and co-managing editor of the CBCF's Journal of the Center for Policy Analysis and Research, as well as the founder of the organization's first editorial board. A graduate of the University of Michigan, Dr. Demesi has also conducted research and policy work in Benin, Ethiopia, Liberia, and Nigeria, focused on democratic governance and gender equality. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Demesi.
Thank you so much, Rashid, and happy Juneteenth to everyone. It's an honor, but also a blessing to be able to reflect on our ancestors and their sacrifices that really helped build the democracy that we live in today. So I know my comments will complement my fellow brothers and sisters' comments, but I think it's important to also recognize that if in this moment that we're witnessing where what I've been saying is sort of like discovering the obvious in terms of our history, I think it's important that truth tellers say the names and do the homework of letting people know that Black history is American history. It always has been. And that as we witness the new generation of young people advancing the Black Lives Matter movement, we understand that our ancestors started the Black Lives Movement long, long ago. And we are seeing the rebirth and the continuation of advancing those policies. So as we think about civic engagement, it's not just going to the voting booth and voting, it's actually asserting our value as human beings. It is our human right to be able to show up and be respected, but also valued as a full human being. And those of you who are political scientists like myself, or those of you who know Black history know that that we have yet to be recognized as full human beings. And so when we talk about things like the Civil War amendments, which we all can recall, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, right, giving birth to the notions of citizenship, came on the backs of Black people, enslaved Africans that were considered less than, right? And then, of course, the 15th Amendment that gave Black men, not women, but Black men, the right to vote. These Civil War amendments are really the bedrock of our democracy. They came out of protests. They came out of death. They came out of Black people willing to say, we are more than, and we're willing to die if future generations can benefit. So, our beliefs and ideas around the traditions of civic engagement go back to our earliest days where we were enslaved Africans, and then we were considered 3/5 of a person. So, why is June 19th, 1865 important? First of all, slavery was abolished in 1863, but the message didn't get to our people until 2 years later, right? And yet all of us are very familiar with July 4th, although it took another 100 years before all of us were free. So, democracy in its sort of first iteration existed, long before the full sort of protections and rights and recognition of our people as human beings. So when we talk about what voting looks like, one voice, one vote, why it's important, we have to understand how far we've come, right? Congressman John Lewis said, the vote is precious. It is the most powerful nonviolent tool we have in a democratic society, and we must use it. We understand that, we're not only voting our voice, we are voting, we're voting in the, out of necessity, because when you think about the 27 constitutional amendments, that's actually 27 attempts for the United States to get democracy right. Democracy is an evolution. It comes on the backs, right? If you have a 13th Amendment, it's because slavery once existed. If you have 14th Amendment, that has to codify and legislate us to be treated as equal citizens under the law, it's because there was a time period where that wasn't happening, right? And we also know that with the 15th Amendment and moving to the 19th Amendment that gave women the right to vote in 1920, which was not that long ago, with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that has now been repealed and gutted so that we cannot successfully combat current restrictive voting rights that are riddled with racial discriminatory tones. It's because those things existed. We are legislating against our own demise, right? And that's why it's important to understand the history when we talk about why you should show up and vote in 2020. When you look at the history of Black voter turnout, you see huge disparities based on race in terms of how many people come out. What President Obama showed was a new invigoration and hope in a reality of equality that people dreamt in theory and we're still trying to gain in actuality. But the statistics continue to show that even in terms of voter turnout, we see these disparities, and there are reasons for that. But if you also look at disparities across a host of socioeconomic indicators, race continues to explain these differences. It's not because we're talking about it. It's because it's the reality of how institutions and structural racism continue to affect our community. So, you know, when we talk about what voting looks like in the 21st century, we have to recognize that there are new forms and challenges against our voting, right? People are talking about the fact that this day is not even a federal holiday yet, right? There are a lot of barriers to voting. It doesn't matter how you vote, but it matters that you do vote. You know, one of the things that we're facing right now, especially with the Congressional Black Caucus, but really all of the United States Congress, is the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. Why is this important? Well, because the Voting Rights Act was curbing a lot of elections, particularly in the Southern Belt, but to ensure that we as in Black people had a fair shot at voting. We know our history has Black codes. Jim Crow continued to instill fear and terror among our people so that we wouldn't show up. And so we had to legislate that, right? That's what we had to legislate to protect you know, our ability to show up in our full self and benefit from the full democracy that Black people have fought for so long. And so there were about 12 states that had to get federal pre-clearance from the government to basically fact check and make sure that the elections at state level were done in a fair process. And we know how critical that legislation is. We also know that Shelby versus Holder in 2013 gutted our ability to do that effectively. What we witnessed under President Obama from 2008 to his reelection 2012 was a huge spike in all people of all different walks of life that came to vote. But we also witnessed in that same moment, over 30 states governed by Republican governors introduce sweeping voter restrictive rights, asking people for multiple IDs, voter purging that kicked so many of us off the rolls, arguably unfairly, and a false argument put out there that voter fraud was a real thing when it wasn't. We should have been celebrating that moment when 130 million people came to the polls, but instead what we did was we witnessed people pushing against that, cutting early voting days when so many of our people are working, and you know, the faith-based community is very big in our community, mobilizing the vote and having to constantly face these barriers. The Voting Rights Act was protecting that. And so now we have to reimagine again how we can make sure that we show up. Let me tell you folks, parents, children, everybody, this is the first general election in November without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. We're also in a decennial census where our count is critical. We're working with Stacey Abrams' organization, Fair Count. Since 1790, the census has continued to miscategorize Black people, right? It is so important, just like you vote, it's so important that you also fill out the census. You can do it online, but our count matters. It matters for the reallocation of billions, hundreds of billions of federal dollars for services that we all are entitled to and need. And so we have systematically been undercounted as Black people. So please, and as minorities, Hispanic, I mean, the list goes on and on. We try to do a better job, but it's important that you show up. It's important that you speak out, right? And so as we think about what Black Lives Matter means at a localized level, it doesn't only mean the vote, but it means to vote, right? It doesn't only mean protest, but it means to look to run for office so that you can be the change you want to see, right? It doesn't only mean calling out, President Trump or anybody else who is using vile language that incites violence. It's also doing something about it, right? It's being able to decipher these issues at a very localized level. No one is asking you to change the world overnight, but all of you have a hand in making the world go round. And now is the time to do it. We want allies. We don't care what color you look like. Voting matters for everyone. So as long as you are for the cause and you go back to our history, you'll understand why it's important to show up in November, but why it's also important to show up at your state elections, to know who your governor is. Your governor is the president of your state. When you talk about issues like the death penalty, who your mayor is, it's not just about who's in the White House. It's about the people that you elect that make the daily decisions that affect you and your children and your community's everyday life. So as I close, I just want to recognize that the power of civic engagement is really being the change you want to see, but also recognizing that our democracy only works insofar as we're able to fully participate in it. And so for all of you who also might be jaded by what's happening or invigorated by what's happening, and you want to vote, but you don't necessarily understand why, no one's asking you to be an expert on the issues, but you should read, know your history, ask questions, because everybody cares about the destiny of their family and community. And the more we do a better job of understanding days like today, which have been around since 1865, right? It's important that we keep knowing our history, but also understanding that we need to meet systematic oppression with systematic change. When you know better, you do better, right? And so when we know the sacrifices that our community and our country has made to vote, when we know that was not available for everybody, it gives us insight and inspiration into showing up for not just yourself, but also the future generation of leaders. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Dr. DeMessi, thank you so much for those really powerful words. I'm really excited to actually have your words along with Ms. McClendon's words kind of overlap and continue to push a narrative of the importance of civic engagement across lines of color, across lines of age, but ensuring that people understand that in order for us to bring about that systematic change, it's necessary for us to use our voices in a variety of ways. So with that, I would like to introduce our next speaker. Shaniqua McClendon is the political director of Crooked Media, a network that strives to cover politics and culture in an informative and entertaining way, while also inspiring its audience to take action. In this role, she led the creation of the midterm voter engagement program, Vote Save America, which supported victories of various 2018 political candidates across the country. A graduate of both Harvard and University of North Carolina, Ms. McClendon has several years of experience working on Capitol Hill, serving as policy advisor to Senator K.R. Hagan and the legislative director to Congresswoman Alma S. Adams, where she spearheaded the creation of the first ever congressional bipartisan HBCU caucus. Additionally, Ms. McClendon served as an intern in the Office of the Presidential Correspondent during President Barack Obama's term. Thank you so much for being with us today, Ms. McClendon. One of the first questions I'd like to ask is, number one, what trends in Black voter registration and participation, particularly after the 2016 election, are worth noting, specifically around younger and first-time voters?
Yeah, thank you for having me. And thank you for saying that I was under the Obama administration that I was interning. I always like to make that clear for people. So yeah, some of the trends that we've seen, I think it's important before we start comparing years, just to point out that midterm elections, and which would have been in 2018, and presidential elections have different levels of turnout. Most of the time, we see a lot more turnout in presidential elections. So from 2016 to 2018 will look different from 2016 to this November. But looking back to 2014 to 2018, young people and people of color are pretty much why Democrats were able to take back the House and see a lot of down ballot victories. excuse me, you know, they're Gen Z. It's weird because millennials used to kind of have the spotlight on them, which I'm a millennial, but now Gen Z is getting a lot of the attention. And it was amazing to watch them in 2018 really show up. I think a lot of unfortunate circumstances led to them being more engaged. We saw a lot of school shootings really mobilize young people, but also you kind of saw this amongst millennials having less of an affiliation and attachment to our traditional parties. But I think Gen Z that's continued even more. You know, generally younger people, especially, you know, including Gen Z, are more progressive, and you would assume they would attach themselves to the Democratic Party. But because there's a resistance and kind of a view of both parties that neither is doing what they want them to do, they're not just kind of falling in line, but actually pushing their elected leaders to be better. But back to my main point, we saw a turnout from 2014 to 2018 go up by 16 points for young voters, which typically is measured from 18 to 29 years old. And then amongst Black voter turnout, that went up by 11 points since the 2014 midterms. So again, you know, you saw more young people and more people of color voting. And then when you look at who was elected to the House of Representatives, you saw a lot more young people and a lot more people of color elected to what is now our most diverse House, or House of Representatives. And I think another big part of that is young people are paying attention, but we also, you know, I don't want to say I won't use the word better. We had more exciting and relatable candidates in 2018. You know, I think everyone knows who Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is, and, you know, she didn't win in a competitive district. It was a blue district that probably, you know, once you make it out of the primary, it's yours for the taking. But there's something about her, and I think whether you agree with her politics or not, she is very down to earth. She's relatable, and, you know, she's very clear on what she wants to see out of government and out of the system. And those are the things that she advocates for. And I think a lot of young people can, you know, kind of draw a direct line of the things that they want to do and want to see in the way that she's approaching this. So I kind of went broadly, but we saw good trends, and hopefully, you know, from 2016 to now, we'll see better ones. And one other thing I would just point out, thinking about 2016 to now, there's often this conversation about whether or not Black people showed up to vote in 2016. And, you know, it's frustrating to hear every year, oh, Black people came out, so we did good. And, you know, thanks, Black people. Or in 2016, oh, what happened? You know, you all didn't show up, and now Donald Trump is president. And I just think it's important to remember a couple of things. Black people can make the difference in an election, but the reason that happens is because a lot of white people voted for Donald Trump. And so Black people are like needed to make the difference. So, you know, it can't just be on us not voting when there's a whole group of people, I'm sorry, and I don't mean to be partisan, but when there's a whole group of people who are choosing an option that I would say is a bad choice. In addition to that, you know, I don't think we have enough conversations about the way voter suppression actually limits Black people's ability to participate in the system. And I really think candidates matter. And I don't think it's fair to expect a group of people to show up for a candidate who's not speaking to the issues that are important to them. You know, with senior citizens, elected officials not only, you know, work for their vote, but they work to keep their vote when they're in office. And I don't think that's something we see amongst a lot of candidates. I think they go after the Black vote, but there's not much done once they're in office to keep it. So I know we have more questions, so I won't keep going, but go ahead.
You actually mentioned something that I definitely think is worth highlighting for our attendees. But when you mentioned voter suppression, could you share with us some of the obstacles that currently exist that are limiting Black civic engagement? And then after that, how can the average citizen contribute to efforts to ensure that all voices, specifically those from marginalized groups, are heard in upcoming elections? Yeah,
so I am from North Carolina. And anyone who knows anything about voter suppression knows North Carolina is like the poster child for it. After the Shelby v. Holder decision, and I'll just take a step back. North Carolina, when I still lived there, they were really good on voting. We had tons of early voting. You could do same day registration. When I voted in college for Obama for the first time, I showed up to the library on my college campus, I registered, and I voted all at the same time. And that was because in the 90s, the General Assembly did a study to try to figure out why voter participation was so low. And in order to fix that, they put all these pro-voter policies in place. But then Shelby v. Holder was, that decision came down, and North Carolina was one of the states that just kind of went crazy. And if you followed any of this, Republicans in the state, as they were writing what is referred to as the monster voter ID law, they specifically looked at what types of identification African Americans used. And then they said, okay, those don't count as forms of voter identification. They also looked at the early voting days that African Americans voted on in high numbers and said, okay, we're taking those days out of early voting. And so, just in North Carolina alone, there were these very specific efforts. And it wasn't even like, oh, these are race neutral and they, happen to hurt Black people. They specifically looked at what Black people were doing and said, we're going to stop that. And what you saw after that, when I started working on the Hill, I worked for 2 North Carolina members. Our House delegation had 7 Democrats and 6 Republicans. And after redistricting, and by the time I left, we had 3 Democrats and 10 Republicans. And that is in a state that is about 50-50 Republicans and Democrats. So, that alone shows you that even if Black people voted in North Carolina, they are, concentrated in 3 Democratic districts, and they don't get to have an impact on what the overall state representation looks like in regards to the House of Representatives. And then if you look over at the Senate, I was working for Kay Hagan when she lost in 2014. We lost by 50,000 votes. That still sits with me. But that was also after we had passed a voter ID law, but it wasn't on the books. But a lot of people thought it was on the books. And so even the thought of voter suppression suppresses the vote because people were confused. They didn't know what they needed. And in a state that has, I don't want to mess up the number, I think more than 10 million people, 50,000 votes we should have, been able to find, but there is an impact of those laws. And so a couple of other examples, and this one was mentioned, but purging voters from the rolls, saying, oh, you haven't voted in a while. Okay, that means we don't care about you and we're going to take you off. And then when you do show up to vote, you're not registered and then you can't vote. And poll closings. We saw this in 2018 in Georgia, and quite frankly, across the country, but specifically in Georgia, they closed polling locations in Black communities. And so when you make something that is already not easy harder, that means less of us are able to participate. And so that's kind of all the ways those things run together, but ways that people can help. So I know I just said there's a ton of voter suppression, but voting is a very clear way that people can participate. And it's unfair to keep saying, Black people, I know you have it hard, but you just got to push through. But in as much as you can, stand in those lines. If you can vote by mail or vote early, do that. But making sure that you get your vote recorded is very important. And then moving on from there, if you can babysit for someone who needs to go vote, or cover a shift for someone, if you work with them and they need to go vote and they actually need the time, doing things like that. Sharing information. We at Crooked have a site called Vote Save America, and we have state-specific information on all the states, but share information about the issues that are going on in your community and let people know they can actually have an impact on those things, and not, again, as was mentioned earlier, not just at the federal level. Your state and local elected officials, you have so much more access to them. You can run into them in the grocery store and you can really not get in their face, but you can be very close to them and hold them accountable and make sure they're hearing what you're saying. One other thing I would say, in addition to that, is, people can run for office. I don't think you'll ever find a candidate that directly aligns with everything that you want to do. But if 2018 has taught us anything, having new blood in elected office is a really good thing. So I would encourage people, as they're thinking about civic engagement, not to just limit it to voting, but to also running for office themselves. And, I just kind of want to take a little bit more time to say, hold your elected officials accountable. I worked on the Hill for 6 years. And when you call into your member's office, like we would tally up the calls we got, the letters we got, and we would report that to the member to let them know how people are feeling. And unfortunately, the people who call in the most are, you know, I don't think they're representative of the communities we live in. These are the people who are normally on the fringes and, you know, one, have the time to call a congressional office in the middle of the day, but I will just say that a lot of voices are getting crowded out by the loudest people who normally are a minority. So, you know, make sure you're calling in, and also don't just vote and let people go about their day. Once you give them your vote, like they have to keep it. And if they don't keep their promises, and they should be honest about the feasibility of what they're able to do, you know, you can't, you know, thinking about a school election, you can't promise everyone free ice cream if you can't actually give people free ice cream. But just keep an eye on what they're doing, hold them accountable. And if they don't live up to what you expected, vote them out the next time.
Thank you so much for those perspectives. I think the message is clear that there are a number of ways that we can get involved as the average citizen, but also you highlighted some areas where it is necessary for us to support others as they endeavor to make sure that their voices are heard as well. So thank you. And we're going to transition now, hopefully as seamlessly as possible, from the more explicit form of engagement through political engagement. And now we're going to talk about strides that have been taken and changes that need to happen in our education system. So we're happy to invite Ms. Paula White, our next speaker. Ms. Paula White is the Executive Director of Educators for Excellence's flagship chapter in New York City, which serves a membership of over 14,000 public school educators who seek to use their voices to elevate the teaching profession and improve outcomes for children. She spent 9 years working in Atlanta public schools, then went on to found a public charter school, and later led an initiative that brought trauma-informed practices to traditional public schools in New York City. Among her many other contributions, Ms. White previously served as the New Jersey Department of Education's Chief Turnaround Officer, successfully leading the state's efforts to improve outcomes in its 200 plus lowest achieving public schools. Thank you for joining us, Ms. White.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to all the panelists who have already spoken and to those who will come after me. You know, I think as I'm listening to what folks are talking about, and as I think about the education system, you know, we can say that we have made strides, that we are actually moving forward. And I think that's really important to say. But I want to sort of ground the conversation in a couple of different ways, and just to kind of frame it with a couple of examples. So today is Juneteenth, right? So I want you to imagine that you're going to a barbecue for Juneteenth, and you're going with some friends, you're going with some family, right? Let's say you have 10 people that you're going with, and you get to the barbecue and it's great, you know, there's music, everyone's nice, they're welcoming, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, 77 of the 10 of you get food, and the other 3 of you do not get a chance to have anything to eat, right? So I want you to think about what that means, which is that, you know, you could argue it was a great barbecue, right? If you're just thinking about yourself, and that, yeah, most of us had something to eat, but there were like 3 people who weren't able to sort of partake for whatever reason. So think about framing, what does success look like? That you can say, you know, maybe if the barbecue was 5 years ago, maybe only 4 people got to eat. So that's great that now it's 7, but ideally you want to really weigh what success looks like based on what everyone is able to partake of. And the other thing I want to talk about is sort of like averages, because in education, we talk about numbers all the time, which is super important. And I'm a data geek, numbers all day. That said, sometimes numbers will obscure realities, right? So if I think about my three of my favorite NBA players, I would say, because this is factual, that their average height is 6'3". So you may be automatically thinking, okay, so these 3 people, they're about 6'3" each. Well, actually, that's not true, right? So Isaiah Thomas, who is the shortest person in the NBA, is 5'9". And LeBron James, who's on the higher end, is 6'9". And then Steph Curry, is 6'3". You add all those together, you divide them by 3, you get 6'3", but it doesn't mean that's obscuring the fact that there's a very short person, for that arena in the park, and there's a very tall person there. And so as we look at sort of what has educational achievement looked like in New York City, and I'll just use that as a case study because it lines up pretty well with the rest of the nation, that we have seen achievement gaps close to some extent, and we have seen sort of raw proficiency rates improve. But what we have to sort of think about with that is there's been a little bit of the line sort of going up and down. Typically what happens is that when standards increase and become more rigorous, then you see that achievement gaps widen and that Black and Brown students end up doing comparatively significantly less well. So, from 2000 to 2009, proficiency rates in English and language arts improved by over 30 points and math by about 50 points. So that's really great. But then it took a downturn in 2013 when these standards were raised. And then now it's sort of coming back up again to some extent. There's an exam that's taken called the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. And that's a really good indicator of how students are doing. And what we do see is that for Latinx or Hispanic students, as they're called, on that particular assessment as they're framed, that the achievement gaps are closing by about maybe 7 points. Maybe 10 years ago, there was a 32% of students were achieving, in a certain place. And now that gap has changed by about 7 or 8 points, but it's still not necessarily where it needs to be. I will also say that when you think about what does financial outcomes look like for Black and Brown students as they matriculate through college matriculation rates have gone way up. The graduation rates are still not what they need to be, but those are doing an uptick as well. But in terms of raw dollars, like what does your bank account look like? A lot of that is driven by choice of major. And I think that's really important to say, so that if you look at the top 10 majors in terms of financial remuneration, the number one for Hispanic as well as for Black college graduates is pharmacy. So that if you have, if you are a pharmacist, then you're making, and I'm talking about just out of undergrad, so not like a doctor or someone like an attorney that would have an advanced degree. But then after that, industrial engineering is number 2. Then chemical engineering is number 3. Then electrical engineering is number 4. Then mechanical engineering is number 5. Then computer engineering is number 6. And then you have nursing, and then you have a couple more engineering fields, and then you have computer science. So a lot of what we are able to achieve from a financial perspective after we graduate has to do with the majors that we select. So I think that's really important to mention as well.
Thank you. I'm curious if you could talk to us a little bit about some specific ways that families and citizens can advocate for, if there are specific policies that they should be aware of that they should be supporting or doing more research on to learn about ways to improve outcomes for Black and Brown students, as well as just practices you think schools should begin to adopt, especially as we see that they are more receptive to anti-racist pedagogy and just the struggle that's been ongoing, but there's a spotlight on it now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say standards are really important. And standards, you need to have a good curricular infrastructure. And no matter what, it's like if you go to Kentucky Fried Chicken, if you go to KFC, you expect to get chicken, right? Because that's what they sell. If you go to school, you should have a really strong curricular infrastructure. So if you're a parent, you need to find out, what does the curricular infrastructure look like in my school? Can you tell me what they're going to learn in 7th grade? Can you tell me what they're going to learn in 8th grade? Is what we're learning about Black people, is that going to be in February? Okay, or because we're Black in March too. As a matter of fact, I think we're also Black in April. And so we want to have a really seamless infusion of the contributions of LGBTQ plus Americans, African Americans, Hispanic Americans across the continuum of education. That's really important. And I think assessments are also very important. There's a movement, a lot of people say, you know, why are we giving people tests? And I say we should get rid of all tests. And let me tell you when we should do that. When we get rid of the bar, when we get rid of the medical boards, when we get rid of the plumbing license exam. When we get rid of all those, I say get rid of tests. But before that, it's important for us to be able to equip our students to be able to be ready to show in one way, because that shouldn't be the only way, but to be able to show in one way that they are competent. I would also say culturally informed socioeconomic practices. So, I mean, socio-emotional practices. So for example, here in my town, I live in an upper middle class town, and you know, one of my son's friends went to see his therapist when he didn't make the varsity soccer team. And my son was like, yo, you know, he couldn't believe it. He was like, he didn't make the soccer team, so he has to see his therapist. But guess, you know, but I invited him to look at it a different way. I'm like, actually, that's fine, right? And maybe, so if we have gone through, if somebody goes through that and decides that they need a therapist, then arguably, as we are going through racially inspired trauma, that it is okay for us to say, I need to figure out how to talk to someone about this. And that I should be asking my school, is there a space for me to speak to someone who is credentialed, who can help me to process the feelings that I'm having, because I am human and I deserve to have a space to talk about that. The other thing I would talk about is just two quick things before we close. One is judicious use of funds. So when I ran school improvement for the state of New Jersey, one of the lowest performing districts was getting $32,000 per kid. So it's not just money, because yes, we need money, right? Don't act like you forgot. We need money. However, what we also need is judicious use of funds. And so, you know, I was on my Nordstrom Rack app and I saw Valentino sneakers this morning for $579. So if I got money to go shopping for school clothes and I got $500 and I spent it all on one pair of sneakers, that's not a judicious use of funds, because then I won't have a coat. I won't have, you know, I won't have all the other things I need. So we need to be showing up to school board meetings and saying, not just that we're getting the funds, but how are we using the funds? And the final thing that I would say is college hacking. I think college hacking is really important. If you can go to a school where you can get your associate's degree when you graduate from high school, that's important, because that's going to reduce your overall debt. If you can take CLEP classes if you can take a CLEP exam for $80 and get a 3-credit course, that a 3-credit college course credit, then you should do that. If you can do that with AP, I know not all schools take AP, because some schools, you know, whatever, but most schools do. So if you can take that and get that money, then and get those credits, then that is what you should do. So that when you actually graduate from college, that you have little, if any, debt, so that you can really start with a clean slate and be able to accumulate wealth.
Thank you so much for those powerful insights. We are going to be transitioning. There was mention earlier about LGBTQ populations, and I actually would like to bring on our next speaker, Dr. Sheldon Applewhite, who will speak more in depth about the perspective of the LGBT community of color in this particular time in history, building off of some of the previous streams of thought. So Dr. Sheldon Applewhite is an assistant professor of sociology in the social sciences and human services department at Borough of Manhattan Community College. Dr. Applewhite earned his PhD in sociology from Howard University in 2006, and his specializations are urban and medical sociology. Dr. Applewhite's current work focuses on health disparities among racial and ethnic groups and health issues of the LGBTQ of color populations. His current research primarily focuses as well on HIV prevention strategies for same-sex couples. Dr. Applewhite serves as a board member for the Black Gay Research Group and previously worked as evaluator and research scientist at the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene from 2005 to 2009 with the Healthy Start Brooklyn program, a multi-million-dollar federally funded program that addresses maternal health outcomes. Thank you, Dr. Applewhite, for being with us today. Oops, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I've been doing this enough. I should know better. Thank you for having me, and I want to say hello to all of the panelists and to thank them for their words, which I think are incredible. I'm gonna start by sort of putting this conversation in a historical context around Juneteenth, and I'll try to address some of the concerns of the issues that are facing the LGBTQ community today. And so as we mark the 155th anniversary of Juneteenth, I think it's important to understand the historical moment then and now, as well as the significant contributions that have been continuously made to contribute to American history. There would be no American history without Black history or Latino history or Native American history. And all of these are American history. So two things come to mind when I think about the first Juneteenth celebration and thinking about today. First, I think about the ways in which African slaves were denied basic rights, like the right to read and write. And as we commemorate this important moment in time, we should try to remember the sacrifices that our ancestors made to ensure that all Americans have basic American rights. Today, we see some similarities to the type of oppression that those who came before us face. Right now, we see the average Americans denied the rights in the criminal justice system, Black and brown people forced to take plea deals because they can't afford quality legal representation, longer sentences for the same crimes committed by their white counterparts, and brutalization by law enforcement who are supposed to protect all citizens. And so, while people from all racial and ethnic backgrounds are marching in the streets and celebrating the day, the Black Lives Matter movement and those who support it through action and protest stand on the shoulders of those who came before them. We would be remiss to forget about the sacrifices made by grassroots leaders like Shirley Chisholm, Angela Davis, James Baldwin, Audre Lorde, and Bayard Rustin, who was the architect of the March on Washington in 1963, but for years received little mention because of his sexual orientation. This is not to mention the countless names of Black LGBT people of color who made similar sacrifices, but often go unrecognized. So we should celebrate the recent landmark victories that have been won towards the ideals of emancipation and liberation, such as the same-sex marriage legislation passed in 2015, making same-sex marriage legal in all 50 states, the recent Supreme Court decision making it illegal to discriminate against LGBT people in the workplace last week, and the recent DACA, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals decision permitting immigrants who were brought to this country illegally to continue to work or to go to school and not be deported and advance towards citizenship. Yet and still, we must remember that we have a long way to go to ensure the equal rights and protections for all people in the United States, regardless of their immigration status. Almost 1 in 2 Black gay men in the United States are newly infected with HIV. Resources for this group does not meet their need in terms of the disease burden they endure. Over 40% of African Americans are unemployed because of the COVID crisis we're facing right now. And trans persons of color continuously face negative health and social outcomes, including the group most likely to be assaulted or murdered. People like Alexa Luciana Ruiz, Kelly Stow, Hendy Kadar, and others. So finally, we want to think about the lives that we lost in the last few weeks, but through the history of this country, Breonna Taylor, Sean Bell, Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, and countless others. And so when I think about Juneteenth and I think about the struggles that the LGBT community, the LGBT community of color face, I think about a common thread in terms of fighting for emancipation and against oppression. And we have to continue to fight politically through voting, as it was talked about earlier in the conversation, and activism to ensure that all Americans, especially those who are like the most subjugated in our society, have equal rights.
Thank you. I was hoping that you could speak a little bit more about specific policies or specific ways the average citizen can continue to advocate for equity for the LGBTQ community, understanding that all struggles should be and in many ways are interconnected, but are there specific policies, specific organizations or steps people can take to be better allies in that regard?
Well, I mean, I think that there is a great need right now to like have mentorship and work with young people. I think young LGBT people, especially young LGBT people of color, need guidance and support. They need mentorship. And I think that that mentorship can come from like a wide variety of communities. There are young people who, you know, despite, you know, it being 2020 are being put out in the streets. There are a lot also organizations that could use the support financially and intellectually for people like the people on this call or the people who are in the audience. Oftentimes when we think about distribution of resources for nonprofit organizations that serve these communities, these organizations often go underserved. And I think it's important that we invest in these. If we're invested in communities and we're saying all Black Lives Matter, then we have to invest in these organizations that serve community. There's an organization named Griot Circle, and Griot Circle is an organization dedicated to helping people of color, elderly people of color. Right. And so when we think about like giving, we think about giving to like, you know, the common causes, or we may not, you know, or larger Black organizations like the NAACP. But when you think about it, you know, LGBT people of color, you know, they face conditions and situations that, you know, the rest of the grain of America just don't face, right? They may be faced with issues around homelessness, being ostracized, right? Like not having family members, not having people to take care of them, especially in light of like the COVID crisis, right? We see many elderly people dying alone, not having support systems. So there are many ways that we can contribute to like helping the LGBT community on every level and along the life course, right? Like not only youth, but like elders, right? Because some of these people are lost and they don't have community, and like we can help to offer them that. In terms of legislation, I think, you know, the discrimination, you know, the Supreme Court, I'm actually quite, I don't know if I'm surprised and pleasantly shocked, but it seems to be a positive court as it relates to LGBTQ issues. I do think legislation, and I'm not really sure if the legislation that we're looking at right now around police reform, I don't know if it reflects like the needs of trans people. I think that they are a group that are completely marginalized in terms of employment, in terms of jobs. And so I think this LGBT, this ruling is a step in the right direction, but more needs to be done. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So hopefully, as we transition to our last speaker, Dr. Sasha Bamir, we can continue to focus on the ways that our infrastructure does and does not support marginalized communities. So as we continue with Dr. Bamir, who I'll introduce in a moment, I would love to hear more about the ways that systemic racism has, and I would say systemic racism, systemic homophobia, and transphobia have had a profound impact on the types of medical care and access to care that people of color have received, specifically in light of COVID. So I'd like to thank you, Dr. Applewhite, for your contributions. And now I'm going to introduce our final speaker, Dr. Sasha Bamir, who is a nephrologist and internist who's been working on the front lines during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, working to right some of the disparities in the healthcare system. And so Dr. Mamir, I would love to start with, first of all, create an openness space for you to share any general thoughts or responses based on anything you've heard. And then I have a series of questions that I'd love to throw your way.
Thank you, Rashid. Thank you, everybody, for presenting so well. As a board certified internal medicine doctor and a nephrologist, and many of you may say, well, what's a nephrologist? I'm sure that's a question a lot of people have, but so a nephrologist is basically a doctor that takes care of people with kidney ailments. So anyone who has end-stage kidney disease, meaning you're on dialysis, people who have high blood pressure. We take care of the sickest of the sick. We take care of people in intensive care units, people who have tough to control blood pressure, the sickest patients. Those are the ones that we care for. And as you know, our community is afflicted with many of these illnesses: diabetes, high blood pressure, kidney problems, people who need dialysis, people whose diabetes are out of control, people who live on the margins. Nephrologists, oftentimes, they become the primary care doctors of many of these patients. We also take care of the sickest patients in the hospital as well. So during the COVID pandemic, we were the ones that were tasked to take care of a lot of these ill patients in the intensive care unit, as well as the hospital wards. So throughout this whole entire pandemic, we saw the disparities in the healthcare system. So people made it seem like, okay, African Americans, we have more risk factors. Okay, well, how do we get those risk factors? I don't think our voices were really heard about how, in fact, that those risk factors came to us. So give me one second, sorry. So because of the healthcare disparities, because of the legacy of slavery, because of systemic racism, because of racism and slavery, we were forced to eat foods that were high in salt, high in cholesterol, because we were tasked to work the plantation. So we were given the leftovers that the slave masters weren't eating. So those were the foods rich in saturated fats, rich in carbohydrates. And also, because of the legacy of systemic racism, job opportunities weren't afforded to us. So because of that, we were limited on types of foods we can eat. And also, many people in our communities, we live in food deserts where it's easy to get a $5 meal from a local fast food place, but to get fresh fruits and vegetables, we're tasked, we have to pay a lot of money out of pocket, and most people can't afford that. So because of that, we've developed a lot of problem with high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, coupled on top of that with limitation access to healthcare. So not only we have the risk factors, we have difficulty getting the right access to healthcare. And once we get the access to healthcare, there are a lot of implicit biases as far as getting the right healthcare services. So those are the type of things that we were forced to face with as a community. So when people say, oh, African Americans tend to have more risk factors, and that's why they were more susceptible to the ravages of the pandemic, which is true, but no one puts that into context, how in fact we developed those risk factors, how in fact diabetes became so prevalent in our community, how uncontrolled diabetes became so prevalent in our community, how uncontrolled high blood pressure became so prevalent in our community, how heart disease became so prevalent in our community, how difficulty getting right medication became so prevalent in our community. And one of the things I want to point out, I'm sure you'll ask me about this. So if everyone's saying that African Americans were the most impacted by the coronavirus, the COVID-19 virus, well, how come all the resources, most of the resources weren't allocated to the communities that were most impacted by the pandemic? So when the pandemic when issues in Westchester occurred, we saw there were drive-through testing, there were a lot of resources allocated, but unfortunately, the Black and brown communities were screaming, hey, we're being impacted way more with the pandemic. We make up a lot of the essential workers. How come the resources aren't allocated to our neighborhoods? So they started pushing out these drive-through testing, but a lot of folks in our communities, they don't have cars. So how are they supposed to get this drive-through testing if they don't have cars? So it's things like that I saw, which was really impacted our community to a much higher extent than other communities of color, other communities out there.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, those tiny nuances definitely get lost during throughout the larger narrative. So it's really important for us to hear all of the smaller factors that are building up to what we're currently seeing. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about ways that communities in general, but specifically communities of color, can protect themselves. There's been a lot of talk about a wave 2 of the pandemic, and there's been a lot of
Right.
talk about this not even really being the end of phase 1 yet. And just for our attendees, any recommendations or any insights that maybe have not necessarily been heard but need to be articulated?
Sure. So coronavirus is a respiratory illness. So the thinking in the beginning was this was something what they call a droplet. So the idea of something that's droplet is you're speaking and little viruses are in the air that you breathe. And as you're coughing, you're speaking, little viruses are trapped in air droplets. And those air droplets drop on the surface, and you may touch that surface, and you may touch your eyes or touch your nose and infect yourself. More and more people are realizing, well, the mode of transmission may not in fact be droplets, it may be more airborne. So the particles may stay in the air for a longer period of time, and then you inhale those particles and become infected. And that's why there's recommendations wearing the face masks, the face coverings. So initially the thinking was that, hey, I wear a mask to protect you, you wear a mask to protect me. But I think just wearing the mask protects everybody. You also protect yourself because there's less chance that you will inhale someone else's air droplets. It just adds an extra barrier. So one of the most important things is just wearing a face covering. So when you go outside, wearing a face covering at all times. And it's something that we just have to stress to our community that we must wear coverings, whether you go into a supermarket, you're going out to the park, just always wear a covering. The other thing is testing. Testing is very important. If you feel you might have symptoms, you're not sure, just get tested. It's very easy. It's not very invasive. I've been tested several times just to make sure I'm safe. And when I come home to my family, I'm not bringing anything with me. Just get tested. It's free in New York State. You can go on, you just Google New York State testing sites, and you can easily find a place near you where you can get tested. The other things, hand washing is very important. Avoiding large social gatherings. Those are the main things. So just to kind of give some more about the virus. So 85% of people will be asymptomatic or have mild symptoms. 10% would be a little sicker. So those 10% may have some respiratory issues, but they'll recover. And you have that 5% that will get really sick. And those are the people who have a problem with the breathing, their blood pressure starts dropping, they have high fevers that don't go away. And those are the ones that we need to be most concerned about. Unfortunately, many of that 5% are African Americans. So the risk factors is what they are. That's going to take a long, extended period of time to remedy some of those risk factors, to increase access to healthcare. But I think as far as what we can do today is face covering, hand washing, get tested if you're concerned that you might have been exposed. So those are the big things. And also making sure you stay in contact with your physician, follow-up checkups, and so forth.
Thank you for that. And Dr. Applewhite, I know that you also focus on public health, so I think it'd be interesting to have you jump in here as well. Dr. Bamir, I have one final question for you afterward, but I think this is a great spot for us to also just continue as coronavirus and the pandemic are at the forefront of a lot of people's minds, in addition to a lot of these other pieces. It's just helpful to hear.
Sure, I'm happy to. So I'm from New York City. I live at Harlem, and I teach in Tribeca. And so when the pandemic first reached New York City, my school closed and I sheltered at home, and I sheltered at home from March 11th until May 29th. And so I think some of the things that Dr. Bashir speaks of are very important and critical, especially when being in the epicenter of the pandemic, right? So The neighborhood and the community that I live in, and New York in general, is just densely populated, which it means that no matter where you go, the chances of you kind of running into people are just, it's a greater occurrence. And what that means is that there's a greater chance that you can get exposed as a result of whether it's airborne or you're being exposed to people who may be infected. And so what it does is it makes for a very dangerous situation. I think that the governor of New York did a really great thing, is that he put down, orders for people to stay at home, close the schools on multiple levels, businesses were closed. But I also think what was really important and vital, and why we see second waves in other places, is because they aren't adhering to some of the guidelines that are necessary to get this pandemic under control, namely some of the things that Dr. Bahir said, right? Face coverings, right? Which is super important. In New York City, they implemented policy where if you went into the store at all, if you were walking the streets, you had to wear a face mask, washing your hands for at least 20 seconds. Really important practice, right? To keep people healthy. Home sheltering and self-quarantining, right? Like if you suspect that you have symptoms, to actually stay away from other people if you can, right? And also minimize your contact with other people. But then finally, the last thing that Dr. Bashir said is really testing, right? Testing for COVID and also testing for antibodies. At some point in time, and one of the things we didn't talk about, or he didn't talk about, is mental health issues, right? I live alone, and I was alone for about 8 or 9 weeks. And I started to have issues that looked like a stroke or a heart attack, but were in fact actually anxiety, right? Like I had 2 telemedicine visits during this time. I was prescribed Zoloft to get my anxiety under control. And I'm not a person who normally takes medication for anxiety. And so I'm saying all this to say is that there are a lot of things that are connected, what we in sociology call social determinants of health, right? That are shaping and factoring in on people's chances of becoming infected, right? Like, I come from a culture, let me speak for myself, where we live in close proximity to one another, right? We share things, like we may live with cousins or uncles or nieces, or right? And when you have that kind of family formation, right, it makes it hard to practice some of the things that like the public health experts are saying. And so I do think it's just really important, especially as like, I'm in Dover, Delaware now. I left New York City. I was able to self-quarantine with some friends. We all got tested for COVID and for antibodies, and we were all negative. So we decided to have a communal living space together with one of my really good friends' parents. So I'm in Dover, Delaware. But I encourage people to follow the steps that Dr. Bashir talked about, which is namely testing for COVID. It's very easy. It's a swab. It goes up your nose. It's like, it is not uncomfortable at all. It's just like, and then at least you'll know, and you can protect, the reason why I did it is, I realized that I wasn't physically sick, but I did it to protect the people around me. I did it to protect my elders. I did it to protect the children, like in my building, right? I don't have children, but they're children who are getting this inflammation sort of syndrome. And so it's very important. I think this is a time where we're thinking about this beyond ourselves. Like if we want to fight this disease, this pandemic, we have to think about it beyond our own needs or concerns about getting our hair cut, or, how uncomfortable it'll be to get tested or whatever. And I think these are the things that are affecting the Black community. I mean, I think we are communal people. We embrace our culture, and but I do think that Black people are adhering, contrary to what I think they are really trying to adhere as best they can. But the social conditions under which we live, crowded housing, inadequate housing, inadequate. He talked about food. These are things that contribute to poor health. And COVID seems to like comorbidity with other diseases like diabetes and stroke and heart attack. And so we really got to take care of ourselves and take care of each other. That's it.
Thank you. And yes, thank you. And to return to you, Dr. Bamir, just briefly though, can you clarify in terms of the test itself, how quickly do those results come back? How reliable are the tests that are out currently? Because some people have expressed concerns about that, and some people are just curious in general whether there's a time period that the virus might be latent in a person before there's a positive test.
Right. So excellent question. There's two types of tests mostly on the market. One is the rapid, and that comes back within an hour. Generally speaking, that's not readily available. Usually the hospitals tend to have the market on that because when you admit somebody to the hospital, you want to know if you want to put them in isolation or they can go to the regular floor. So is the rapid. And then the other one is the one that comes back like 2 or 3 days. So for New York State, if you get tested in the community, you have the second one, which takes about 2 or 3 days. So let's say you get tested on Monday. Generally, you should receive the results within 48 to 72 hours. The testing is about 75% reliable. But the more you have symptoms, the more it's reliable. The more there's a higher positive predictive value, which means if you're having symptoms of loss of smell, loss of taste, having fevers, you were in contact with somebody who may have had the COVID virus, there's a higher chance that when you get tested, if you get a positive result, it's going to be more reliable. So therefore, I would say it's about 70%, but the more that you have symptoms, the more reliable it's going to be. Even in the hospital, sometimes people come in and they get tested negative, but you look at the x-ray, it shows that they have pneumonia, they're having fevers, we'll test them again. And the second time it may come out, it may be positive. So testing is not foolproof. So there is a segment of people that would be negative, it'd be a false negative, meaning they have it, but the test comes back negative. So I would say it's about 70% reliable in New York State. As far as the antibody go, that's pretty reliable. That's about 98% reliable, 98 to 99% reliable. So if you get tested for the antibodies, that does mean you were exposed to it. It's very specific, and it's pretty sensitive. So I got tested for the antibodies. Surprisingly, it was negative for me, which was shocking. But
me too.
Yeah, I was so shocked by that. But so the last point I wanted to make was the one thing that the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the early 80s has told us is that communities of color gets impacted way more than other communities. So I know in the beginning of this pandemic, there was some thought that this doesn't affect Black people, because I think the first people to have come in contact with the COVID virus were people who went to Europe or people who went to China and business people. But that's one thing that the AIDS epidemic did teach us, that Black people are always disproportionately impacted from these diseases because of our socioeconomic status. So I just wanted to point that out. And that's just kind of piggyback off what Dr. Applewhite had stated before.
Thank you. While we're on the topic of COVID, we'd love to jump to Ms. White and ask what do you think the impact is going to be so far as the future of people of color in higher education post-coronavirus? What is the impact that the coronavirus is going to have on the higher education world, specifically as it pertains to people of color?
Sure. So, I think we're beginning to see it already. Unfortunately, some institutions of higher learning, some tertiary institutions will not survive. And I think that is because what COVID has done, it's not really making change, it's accelerating change. So I think that there are some trends that already existed, but because of COVID, we're seeing the acceleration of those things. And, one of the things has to do with sort of remote learning. A lot of colleges and universities are saying, well, we want students to show up to school. And part of that is because they're saying, we are giving parents and families, you know, a $50,000 bill or a $25,000 bill. And it's going to be hard to rationalize that if they are on their computers on Zoom, right? Like there's going to be this sort of tension around return on investment. And parents are going to be walking by the screen going, is that it? You know? And so they feel quite afraid that like, we're going to have students come into school, but then doing that is also going to increase risk. I know that one of our panelists is a graduate of Harvard. One of the things like this year, schools are going to be going more into their waiting list than ever before. So it's a really good time for students to apply to colleges that may have been a little bit more of a reach for them in the past. And also to think about, some schools are also suspending the requirements around testing, around SAT or ACT testing, just because of all the flux and so many students having had their education interrupted. So now is a good time to sort of really think about getting into the right school for you, knowing full well that as the years shake out moving forward, schools that were already in a tenuous place, there are some of them that are not going to be able to survive. But others may come out smelling like a rose in ways that we did not necessarily expect if they're able to really rise to the occasion. And that's one of the reasons why I'm saying, really try to hack school, really try to, get the best bang for your buck. And I would be remiss if I don't say it at the K-12 level, that we're going to see some gaps in the same way that we see a summer slide, when students are off for 2 or 3 months and they come back in the fall, we're going to see a COVID slide. And unfortunately, that's because we have teachers unions in some cases and districts in other cases, and both that are not really holding the bar high. So you can have a teacher at one school who is having FaceTime with children every day, and you can have a teacher at another school who says, well, I'm just going to send worksheets and I'll check in every couple of weeks. So that you have students who have had little or no FaceTime during this time of the pandemic, and they are going to have a much bigger gap in their learning than those who have had consistent interface with their educators, as I'm sure students at your campuses have.
Thank you. Final question, turning it to you, Ms. McClendon. Thinking a lot about even the basic politicization of even wearing a face mask, is that becoming something of a message, or being interpreted as a message, although we know that it's really simply a matter of health. Was curious to hear about the ways that certain organizations, for example, Vote Save America and any other get out the vote focused institutions and organizations, are working in spite of the coronavirus and in spite of the already existing obstacles that there are for people of color who are just trying to get around voter suppression measures, who now have to make a choice between being civically engaged and staying healthy.
Yeah. So in 2018, when we launched Vote Save America, we just wanted everyone to go vote. And now, in light of coronavirus, we have had to, because we spent all of 2019 putting this shiny program together, and then coronavirus hit, and now we're having to reshift it to really focus on voting by mail. And so we did a calling campaign to Congress, which is still going on because they still haven't voted on the next coronavirus package, but really encouraging them, or urging them, to include hopefully the $4 billion that a lot of people have said is necessary to go to states, so that election officials can ensure they have really strong vote by mail programs. But one of the things that we know about this is, even if we get all this money out to the states, there are efforts to defund the postal system, and then some communities just don't have reliable mail service. So what we're doing is really focusing on folks who can vote by mail easily, and really encouraging them to do that, so that the people who do have to show up to the polls will have a safer experience. So part of that money that Congress or House Democrats are pushing for, that $4 billion, is to strengthen vote by mail programs, but it's also to increase early voting to about 15 days. If there are more days for people to vote, fewer people will show up every day so they can have a safer experience. Having more polling locations with fewer voting booths in each one, again, fewer people in a location. So we don't see what we have seen in Wisconsin and in Georgia. So yeah, we're trying to push as many people as possible to vote by mail to lighten the load on in-person voting so that people who show up there can have the safest experience possible. And it's such a weird environment we're in now, because I think so many people are paying attention because of coronavirus and because of a lot of the racial injustice that has most recently been pushed to the forefront. But people are really paying attention to their elected leaders right now, and they want to participate. And we saw that in Wisconsin and Georgia, but it's at a great risk. And hopefully we can get, again, as many people as possible to vote by mail and make in-person voting safer. But not to scare anyone, I just have, a lot of concerns because people do want to participate now. But because of voter suppression, they are being forced to stand outside for hours on end. Some places not social distancing the way that they should. And one other thing I will add is a lot of poll workers are typically older people who are retired already. And so something that people can do, younger people who are healthy, is be volunteer on election day or during early voting to be a poll watcher or a poll volunteer. They help kind of facilitate what's happening at the polls, and right now keeping people safe, making sure people are social distancing, bringing ballots out to people who maybe can't walk or can't get into the voting booth for other health reasons, bringing ballots out to them and helping them fill out their ballots. So that is something that younger people can do and help fill that space, because it's a lot riskier for our senior citizens to, participate the ways that they have in the past. But yes, that's kind of, vote by mail if you can. And if not, encourage a bunch of other people too, so that it can be safer for those who have to show up.
Wonderful. Thank you. So I would like to thank all of our panelists, 100%. This has been such an inspiring and enlightening conversation, this virtual community conversation. I'd like to turn it over again to our CEO, Ms. Natasha Trivers, with some closing remarks before we come to the end of our time together.
Thanks so much, Rashid. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us today for such an important conversation. Huge thank you to our incredible moderator, our civics program director, Rashid DeRosso, and a big thank you to our panelists, Dr. Mena Demesi, Ms. Shaniqua McClendon, Ms. Paula White, Dr. Sasha Balmier, and Dr. Sheldon Applewhite. We are so grateful for this critical conversation at such an important moment. Democracy Prep team and family and friends of Democracy Prep, I'm looking forward to many more conversations like this one. So just know that's coming. Happy Juneteenth, everyone. Let's continue to work hard to be conscious, to be active, to do the work necessary to empower and support our communities, to lead anti-racist organizations, and to foster self-determination with the young people of color that we work with. Have a wonderful weekend, and thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Panelists, I will be